Oh, hello. Do you think that Big Brother's watching? Or that the Illuminati is planning to take over the world? Have you happened to have an encounter with a space alien today? Well, if the answer to those questions is yes, then grab your hat. This is tinfoil hat time. Welcome back to tinfoil hat time. This is Tom. So, this is the 10th episode of tinfoil hat time. I can't even believe it. And who knows, if this thing just keeps on going well, maybe we'll even have 100 before too long, although I imagine that might take a year or two if I only do one a week. It's kind of the goal anyway. Approximately one a week or so. Now, what we're going to talk about today is lists. There's been some talk in the political world about lists. President-elect Trump has said he wanted to restrict Islamic people from coming into the country. This may or may not be a decent idea. Who knows? Honestly, I've studied a little bit about the Islamic faith, and I don't really want to give an opinion on that, especially since I'm a white fundamental Christian. But all I'm going to say here is I'm going to come out in defense to say lists are a bad thing. They've always been a bad thing. And I want to make sure that as we go about our society, we're not duped into putting anybody on any lists. I don't care what your faith is. I don't care what your color is. I don't care what your gender is. None of that really matters. What really matters most is not the divisions, but coming together as people. And I can tell you that every time lists were made, whether it was by the people making the lists or by other people getting those lists and exploiting them, bad things happen when lists are made. Because we have an inherent human nature that leans towards not doing the right thing. That doesn't mean everybody's going to always do bad stuff. But what it does mean is that we, as a society, we have to come together while at the same time we have to recognize the potential for downfall. This is what some people will call a turnkey democracy, meaning that even if we trust the government now, we want to produce these lists for us now. In a few years, somebody else might come into power and utilize those lists for bad things. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Now, I'm going to start out with a case history. And there's actually a little bit of muddied water surrounding this, so I'm going to have to tread carefully. And it has to do with registered guns and Nazi Germany. Because some people jump out and say that the entire perspective is Nazi Germany registered guns and then used all those lists to disarm the people. And in reality, that did happen. The amount of evidence is overwhelming. But I dug into an argument from a law professor who actually comes from a Jewish background, who actually said at the end of his document that he said, I'm kind of forced to agree with the skinheads in the basis that the Nazis were not nearly as anti-gun as the previous government in that country was. And in fact, he's right. However, there's a key fundamental principle he's missing. So I have the actual document will be in the references on my main website at switchtolinux.com. You can go there and grab all of the references because I'm not going to put all of the references at the bottom of the video. You go there. All of the references are listed and everything is there. But I'm going to look at a few different quotes and tell you a little bit about the history. Obviously, when Germany lost World War I, in 1919, some laws were put into place which literally disarmed all citizens who are not an actual part of the government. And so that really did happen. And then what happened is when the Nazi Party came into play, the laws changed a little bit. And that is actually quite significant because what happened is this. This quote came about. And this came from this gentleman's argument here, which is called On Gun Registration, the NRA, Adolf Hitler, and the Nazi gun laws, exploring the gun culture wars. So he says, thus, the 1928 law was put in effect a strict licensing scheme that covered all aspects of firearms, from the manufacture to the sale, including repair and even the reloading of ammunition. It explicitly revoked the 1919 regulations on weapon ownership, which had banned all firearms possession and thereby liberated firearms regulations. Okay, so that being said, it is important to note that in 1919, it was illegal for a basic German citizen to own a firearm. In 1928, the laws had changed that allowed firearms as long as they were registered. So the entire author of this article, which came out of the University of Chicago Law School, is that the Nazi Germany was anti-gun, and he's trying to argue that no, they were pro-gun. See, they liberated the firearms laws. Well, what they did here, and the logical fallacy that this author is missing, is that it is a different scenario to say the citizenry is disarmed versus the citizenry is armed, but we know who they all are. And that made the crux of the difference. Now, if you study the founding fathers and the founding history in America, one of the founding fathers, and I want to say it was Jefferson, but don't quote me exactly, I forgot to look for the quote, but he said the best defense we have against a tyrannical government is a well-armed private militia. And the fact of the matter is, and this law professor identifies several cases where gun registrations were never exploited by the people. Possibly. We know that there were some gun registrations in Great Britain in the 1800s. We know that even before the United States was founded under what we currently know as the United States, we know that the people were required to register their firearms with the local government, which at that time was still a British consul. So I don't know what the interplay was with that and the independence. So you get all these different factors going on. The biggest problem with all this is it's all a lot of history, and some of the history can be biased one way or the other. But needless to say, there's a critical difference between the 1919 regulations that forbid a citizen from owning a weapon and the 1928 registration that required a citizen to register their weapons. And that's where the logical fallacy is. Because once the Nazis knew who had the guns, then they could go to disarm the people. And you say, well, that's all Nazi Germany, and we know all that was bad, and we've learned all of our lessons. But there was a problem, and that is the Newtown school shooting in December of 2012. When this had occurred, it raged this giant, it raged this absolutely giant debate among the gun wars, and I remember that time. There was a lot of stuff going back and forth, and it turns out that people were talking about we need to create a new registry for have all these guns and all this kind of stuff going on, and this sparked a lot of debates. And it turns out that one state, New York, required a state centralized gun registry, which it wasn't like you could go online to say, hey, let me look up these people, but it was considered public documents, which meant that the people could actually go, you could make a request to the government to get some of those documents, and that's what some people did. And one journalist group ended up getting that list of information and publishing it on a map. And so what ended up happening here is this news agency grabbed all the data and they published it on an interactive map which covered two counties, the two closest counties where they serve the most. And this caused a giant outrage. And now this article is from CNN, which is definitely an anti-gun leaning group, and here they're even publishing it. This was huge news if you remember back at that time. And basically what had happened is you could now get on this interactive map and you can look up names and addresses of people who had either registered guns, purchased guns, or renewed permits within the last 5 years. Now, if you go back and click on the interactive map link down here in the article description, then it will tell you there that it's a 404 page. Obviously, they took this map down. This caused a huge amount of controversy. But another thing that happened was that in the midst of all of this, the people who had published this, they ended up endangering some folks. And by endangering some folks, what I mean by that is that there were some people that were literally intentionally targeted because their name was on that list. And some of those targets were from anti-gun people targeting people who owned guns, and some of it were criminals trying to break into houses to steal guns. And so by the news organization jumping out and saying, hey, we're going to do something different here than, publish all these names, publish all this data, it ended up causing the very problem they were trying to defeat, and that was putting guns in the hands of criminals, because they're not going to register them illegally. They're going to go and steal them. And if they have a publicized list as to where there may be guns, well, some people might argue you don't want to break in there because they might shoot you. Some people might argue, hey, maybe they're surveilling you, and when you leave, they break in, steal your guns. So you get that basic premise going back and forth. Now, this article's not about guns. It just turns out that there's a lot of controversy and a lot of discussion about guns, gun lists, gun registrations, and how those things have been abused. And that's why I talk so much about that. Now, obviously, the modern day example is certainly a case there, and this is why we want to be cautious of any lists. Now, I am, as I said, a fundamentalist Christian. I do not agree with the Muslim or Islamic faith probably on any tenet other than the historical merits. Okay, we know that we have an ancestor in Abraham. Okay, but outside of that, I'm not going to agree with a whole lot on the Muslim faith, but I want to stand with them to say we do not want comprehensive lists. I don't want lists of religions. I don't want lists of colors. I don't want lists of genders. And I am kind of in favor of getting rid of any of these types of lists. Now, this poses a problem. Now, back in 91? Maybe it's 91. Somewhere around 91. An organization in the United States government as a division of the Department of Justice was founded, and what this group ended up doing is creating a list of non-immigrant people from Iraqi and Kuwaiti countries. And so with those specific areas, they were keeping a registration. Now, when President-elect Trump said that he wanted to deport Muslims, it was pushed out in the news just last week that the current presidency under Obama had put an end to all of the remainder portions of that thing and had allegedly destroyed all the lists. And I have the references on my website from the Department of Homeland Security where they're talking about it. But in reality, they didn't really change much. All they did is said, we're retiring this old out-of-date program simply because we have a whole lot better new technology coming out. And this kind of ties us into Switch to Linux and where we are as far as the tinfoil hat and what's going on with all the lists, because the biggest problem is not that the government maintains a list, but this thing called the third-party doctrine. So our Constitution prevents the government from doing searches and seizures of us, which includes mass surveillance. And they would not want to argue on it before Snowden released the documents he released, because there's some funny thing that the courts cannot deem something as legal or illegal unless we know it's being done. And with the Snowden documents, they said, okay, we have enough evidence it might be done, so now let's rule on it. Oh, it's unconstitutional, so you have to stop it. So they stopped all that. The problem is you have this thing called third-party doctrine. And that means that while the government may not surveil you, you may be surveilled by a private organization like Facebook or Apple or Microsoft, and it's not outside the realm of possibility that data that those companies collect can be used. Now, Microsoft releases the data as to how many requests there are made for data. And they had, in the first part of 2016, greater than 35,000 requests. And they said only about 2.5% of those actually result in data being handed over, which is good. Apple does not release such information. I didn't look up Google. But the bottom line for me that concerns me the most in all of that is that it's not just what data are they giving there, but what data are they giving to what of their business partners, and how many of those business partners may or may not be other government agencies. And so for me, the greatest idea, the greatest thing is to limit the amount of data that companies have about you. And that means being cautious and conscientious of the services that we use. So, in other words, your basic computer system, if you're still on Windows or you're still on Mac, those computer systems gather a lot of data about you. And you agree to let them gather that data as part of the terms and conditions of using it. But all sorts of other things, from the watches to the smartphones to, I mean, even I think bought a universal remote last year that I was totally shocked that you had to go online, create some online account to use the stupid thing, agree to terms and conditions for a remote. This is ludicrous! A remote! Stop! Of course, I did it all under fake stuff with fake IP address because it's none of Logitech's business what devices I'm controlling with the remote. Oh, for the love. Oh, boy. Lists are a bad thing. Now, the biggest thing for us to do is remember that we need to stand against the lists. We need to stand against the data collection. Switching over to a Linux operating system is a very good way to do that. But we also need to keep in mind that we need to watch all of the things that we're doing. And even if somebody does not specifically agree with our specific ideology, we still need to make certain that we are taking a stand, even if in this case of an absolute conservative Christian standing with the Muslim community and saying, I don't want that data collection. And the biggest reason I want to make this point is because of this. From Martin Niemöller, first they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. Now that quote is frequently attributed to Bonhoeffer. In reality, it was Niemöller's quote, who is a friend of Bonhoeffer's. I think Bonhoeffer's just a little bit more popular. But these were two pastors in Nazi Germany who stood against Hitler and what he was doing. And they were both arrested for their crimes. And Bonhoeffer was eventually killed in a concentration camp, and Niemöller ended up surviving the Nazi occupation. But overall, this is the premise that we have to be cautious of. That if we allow ourselves, the world, to be segmented and divided, that is what is going to conquer us as people. We need to be cautious of that. Very cautious of that. I stand against all lists. I don't care if you think it's something we have to do. I stand against lists because there's too much downside to it. There's too many issues. There's too many problems. Watch those terms and conditions. Watch those privacy policies and weigh consciously whether you need to use some particular device or not. This has been Tom with a tinfoil hat time.